Good evening. And here we are again for Tales and Cocktails. Now, I have a book called Great Stories from History, 365 for every day of the year. And the entry for today, 25 January, is entitled Al Capone, America's Greatest Gangster, Croaks at Last. So I want to read you a couple of things about Al Capone. First of all, I'll do the biography as is written in this book, this Great Stories from History. And then I have an interview that is entitled Mr. Capone, Philosopher. So we'll start with a bio. 1947. Today in Palm Island, Florida, Al Capone, the most notorious gangster in U.S. history, died 4 days after his 48th birthday of an apoplectic stroke complicated by pneumonia. Slow of mind from the ravages of syphilis, he had lived his final 8 years in retirement on his Florida estate after 8.5 years in prison. Raised in Brooklyn, of Neapolitan immigrant parents, Capone had left school when he was 12 and had soon become a violent criminal. As a teenager, he had murdered at least 2 men, for which he was never convicted. It was during this time in Brooklyn that he gained the nickname Scarface, when he insulted a young woman in a bar-cum-whorehouse named the Harvard Inn, and her hoodlum brother slashed his face with a razor. At 20, Capone moved to Chicago, where he quickly moved up in the gangland hierarchy. Soon he became the city's leading mobster, controlling gambling houses, brothels, and racetracks. But his most lucrative business was the illicit sale of alcohol in prohibition-ridden America. His organization ran a string of illegal nightclubs, speakeasies, and distilleries, and generated an income in excess of $100 million a year. To gain and hold his empire, Capone ruthlessly wiped out all underworld competitors. His most infamous murder was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, when 4 of his henchmen, 2 masquerading as policemen, entered a garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago, where the rival bootlegger Bugs Moran kept his headquarters. There they lined up 6 of Moran's gang, plus an unlucky garage attendant, against a wall and opened fire with 2 shotguns and 2 machine guns. Moran himself, who was probably the intended victim, was across the street and survived the day. But his rivalry with Capone was over, and he drifted into petty crime, eventually dying in Leavenworth Penitentiary. For years, Capone seemed immune from prosecution in a city famous for the corruption of both its administration and its police force, and the federal government despaired of bringing him to justice. But finally, ignoring his murders, extortion, and other more brutal crimes, the government came up with the idea of prosecuting him for tax evasion. For Capone had never filed a tax return. In 1931, Capone was indicted for tax evasion and, along with 68 of his henchmen, for violating prohibition laws. When the trial judge refused to do a deal, Capone tried to bribe the jury, but the judge astutely changed the jury members at the last minute. And in the film The Untouchables, that is a wonderful scene, when the judge instructs the bailiff to take that jury out to the courtroom next door and exchange it for the courtroom next door's jury, and leads them back in, to the absolute fury and outrage of Capone and his lawyers. It's a wonderful scene. So, where was I? On 17 October, Capone was convicted on only 5 of the 22 counts against him, but that was sufficient to earn an 11-year sentence plus a $50,000 fine. Capone was still only 33 when he started his term at Atlanta, and he had soon become the kingpin of the prison's inmates and obtained special privileges from the warders. Determined that he should experience a more rigorous regime, the government transferred him to the notorious Alcatraz prison on an island in San Francisco Bay, where he had no contact with the outside world. While incarcerated at Alcatraz, Capone began to show signs of the dementia caused by tertiary syphilis. He was later transferred to Terminal Island in California, and then finally released on 16 November 1939. Now a free man, he moved to his estate in Florida, but his failing mind precluded further mob activity, and he lived in slow-witted retirement until his unmourned death. That is the bio. And now let us have an interview with Al Capone. It is by Claude Cockburn, and it is entitled Mr. Capone, Philosopher. In Chicago, the director of the Illinois Central Bank, to whom I had been putting solemn questions on the subjects of car loadings, commodity prices, and the like, said moodily, "Hell, boy, the capitalist system's on the skids anyway. Let's go and get a drink." I was glad of this attitude on his part, because I had not really come to Chicago to discuss commodity prices in the Middle West, but to report the background to a murder. A couple of days before, we in New York had read the news of the killing in broad daylight of Jake Lingle, then crime reporter of the Chicago Tribune, and, as emerged later, an important liaison officer between the Capone gang and the police department. It was one of the most spectacular, and for many reasons looked like being one of the most revealing Chicago killings of the period when Al Capone was at approximately the height of his power. From a friend in New York who knew Chicago, I learned enough of the background of the crime to make me very eager to go to Chicago myself. Hinrichs, who thought it would be a splendid story, was nevertheless hesitant. He explained to me that whenever the Times, that's the Times of London, published a crime story from the United States, somebody from the American Embassy or the English-speaking Union or some other agency for promoting Anglo-American relations would ring up or would attack the editor at dinner, saying how much he had always previously admired the Times' treatment of American affairs, and could there not be at least one British newspaper which did not represent the United States as a land dominated by gunmen and hoodlums? Hinrichs thought we had better cable London, asking whether they wished me to go on to Chicago. As an assignment to report a murder, the reply from the Times was probably a classic. "By all means," it said. "Cockburn, Chicago wards. Welcome stories, ex-Chicago, not unduly emphasizing crime." By the time I was in the air over Cleveland, the difficulty of carrying out this directive successfully had notably increased. Ex-Ambassador Charlie Gates Dawes had impetuously been drafted, or had drafted himself, to act as strongman of the situation, to put himself, it was stated, at the head of the better element and to clean up Chicago. Before I touched down at Chicago Airport, he had arrested nearly 600 people, and a number of others had been wounded in indiscriminate gunplay. I drove to the Criminal Courts building and sought the advice of the Dean of Chicago Crime Reporters, the original, I believe, of one of the central characters in Ben Heck's play, The Front Page. I showed him my cable. His deep laughter shook the desk. What, he asked, did I want to do? I said I suppose the first thing to do was to interview Mr. Capone. He suggested that I listen in on an extension while he telephoned Mr. Capone at the Lexington Hotel, where he then had his offices. Presently, I heard Capone's voice on the wire, asking what went on. The crime reporter explained that there was a limey from the London Times who wanted to talk with him. They fixed up an appointment for the following afternoon, and just before he rang off, the crime reporter said, "Listen, Al, there's just one thing. You know this bird's assignment says he's to cover all this, not unduly emphasizing crime." Bewilderment exploded at the other end of the line. "Not what?" Capone said. "You heard me," said the crime reporter. "Not unduly emphasizing crime." The Lexington Hotel had once, I think, been a rather grand family hotel, but now its large and gloomy lobby was deserted, except for a couple of bulging Sicilians and a reception clerk who looked at one across the counter with the expression of a speakeasy proprietor looking through the grill at a potential detective. He checked on my appointment with some superior upstairs, and as I stepped into the elevator, I felt my hips and sides being gently frisked by the tapping hands of one of the lounging Sicilians. There were a couple of anterooms to be passed before you got to Capone's office, and in the first of them I had to wait for a quarter of an hour or so, drinking whiskey poured by a man who used his left hand for the bottle and kept the other in his pocket. Except that there was a submachine gun, operated by a man called McGurn, whom I later got to know and somewhat esteem, poking through the transom of a door behind the big desk. Capone's own room was nearly indistinguishable from that of, say, a newly arrived Texan oil millionaire. Apart from the jowly young murderer on the far side of the desk, what took the eye were a number of large, flattish, solid silver bowls upon the desk, each filled with roses. They were nice to look at, and they had another purpose too, for Capone, when agitated, stood up and dipped the tips of his fingers in the water in which floated the roses. I had been a little embarrassed as to how the interview was to be launched. Naturally, the hub of all such interviews is somehow to get around to the question, what makes you tick? But in the case of this millionaire killer, the approach to this central question seemed mined with dangerous impediments. However, on the way down to the Lexington Hotel, I had had the good fortune to see, in I think the Chicago Daily News, some statistics offered by an insurance company, which dealt with the average expectation of life of gangsters in Chicago. I forget exactly what the average expectation was, and also the exact age of Capone at that time. I think he was in his early 30s. The point was, however, that in any case, he was 4 years older than the upper limit considered by the insurance company to be the proper average expectation of life for a Chicago gangster. This seemed to offer a more or less neutral and academic line of approach, and after the ordinary greetings, I asked Capone whether he had read this piece of statistics in the paper. He said that he had. I asked him whether he considered the estimate reasonably accurate. He said that he thought that the insurance companies and the newspaper boys probably knew their stuff. In that case, I asked him, how does it feel to be, say, 4 years over the age? He took the question quite seriously and spoke of the matter with neither more nor less excitement or agitation than a man would who, let us say, had been asked whether he, as the rear machine gunner of a bomber, was aware of the average incidence of casualties in that occupation. He apparently assumed that sooner or later he would be shot, despite the elaborate precautions which he regularly took. The idea that, as afterwards turned out to be the case, he would be arrested by the federal authorities for income tax evasion had not, I think, at that time so much as crossed his mind. And after all, he said with a little bit of corn and ham somewhere at the back of his throat, suppose he had not gone into this racket, what would he have been doing? He would, he said, have been selling newspapers barefoot on the street in Brooklyn. He stood up as he spoke, cooling his fingertips in the rose bowl in front of him. He sat down again, brooding and sighing. Despite the ham and corn, what he said was probably true. And I said so, sympathetically. A little bit too sympathetically, as immediately emerged. For as I spoke, I saw him looking at me suspiciously, not to say censoriously. My remarks about the harsh way the world treats barefoot boys in Brooklyn were interrupted by an urgent, angry waggle of his podgy hand. Listen, he said, don't get the idea I'm one of these goddamn radicals. Don't get the idea I'm knocking the American system. The American system, as though an invisible chairman had called upon him for a few words, he broke into an oration upon the theme. He praised freedom, enterprise, and the pioneers. He spoke of our heritage. He referred with contemptuous disgust to socialism and anarchism. My rackets, he repeated several times, are run on strictly American lines, and they're going to stay that way. This turned out to be a reference to the fact that he had recently been elected the president of the Unione Siciliana, a slightly mysterious, partially criminal society, which certainly had its roots in the mafia. Its power and importance varied sharply from year to year. Sometimes there did seem to be evidence that it was a secret society of real power, and at other times it seemed more in the nature of a mutual benefit association, not essentially much more menacingly than, say, the Elks. Capone's complaint just now was that the Unione was what he called lousy with black hand stuff. Can you imagine, he said, people going in for what they call these blood feuds? Some guy's grandfather was killed by some other guy's grandfather, and this guy thinks that's good enough reason to kill the other? It was, he said, entirely unbusinesslike. His vision of the American system began to excite him profoundly. And now he was on his feet again, leaning across the desk like the chairman of a board meeting, his fingers plunged in the rose bowls. This American system of ours, he shouted, call it Americanism, call it capitalism, call it what you like, gives to each and every one of us a great opportunity if we only seize it with both hands and make the most of it. He held out his hand towards me, the fingers dripping a little, and stared at me sternly for a few seconds before reseating himself. That's Claude Cockburn, and his interview with Al Capone, and I wish I had more of it. Let me see if I can find it. Anyway, that's our glimpse of Al Capone. Whew. So, my dears, it's a short one today, but I hope a fun one, and I hope an elucidating one. And I will see you again next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails. And we will have a longer session next time. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining me.